Hello, and welcome to the Election Assistance Commission's training on reconciling mail ballots and applications. This training will help you understand what reconciliation is, why it's a critical part of administering an election, and how to implement effective reconciliation practices. Reconciliation requirements and processes vary in each state. In this module, we will discuss some common elements and effective practices that may be useful in your office, but it's important for you to review and follow the specific requirements in your state. Let's get started. Mail ballot reconciliation is the process election officials use to keep track of each mail ballot that has been issued to a voter. If an application is required to receive a ballot, reconciliation keeps track of those records too. Reconciliation occurs at several points during the mail voting process, including when mail ballots are issued and returned, and when voted ballots are opened and counted by election workers. The process typically involves keeping a log of individual ballots and applications as each one is processed, and verifying and documenting the total number of ballots and applications processed after completing a batch, or at the end of each day. These procedures are critical because they allow election officials, voters, and the public to know that certified election results include every valid ballot cast, and only those ballots. Let's look at 4 important steps your office should take before voting begins to prepare to reconcile applications and ballots efficiently, accurately, and transparently. 1. Develop standard operating procedures and training. 2. Plan to involve multiple personnel. 3. Think through the documentation you'll create. And 4. Understand the technology involved. 1. Develop standard operating procedures and training. To encourage consistency, develop standard operating procedures before voting begins. Include both the normal process and what to do in unusual situations, like if a ballot has been damaged in the mail. Train election workers and staff to follow procedure and have a contingency plan ready that details how you will reconcile ballots in the event of technology failure or other problems. 2. Plan to involve multiple personnel. For accountability and accuracy, consider creating a process that involves multiple personnel at each step, working in bipartisan teams if possible. For example, you might require that 2 election workers verify the number of ballots scanned and compare that to the number of ballots accepted for counting. 3. Create thorough documentation. It is important to maintain accurate records throughout the reconciliation process. This includes documenting routine transactions, like the successful issuance of a ballot, but also non-routine transactions, like when a ballot is reissued to a voter. Creating a single reconciliation log that follows a batch of ballots through the process can also make it easier to ensure they're accounted for properly at each step. It is also critical to understand what documentation is required by law or regulation, and how long documentation and materials must be retained after the election. Generally, federal law requires election officials to retain federal election records for 22 months, and state law or regulations may require additional retention. 4. Understand the technology involved. Make sure that election workers fully understand the technology involved. You may be required to use certain technology to perform reconciliation, while other technology may be optional. For example, many election officials use their voter registration system to document ballots issued and received, and track rejections. These systems can often produce reports with combined counts of these actions, either by batch, workday, or in total for the entire election, which can be very useful for reconciliation. Some election officials use automated mail sorters that can also provide reports to help balance the number of ballots physically received and scanned against the records in the voter registration system. The rest of our training will show you a few simple examples of how reconciliation can work at several points in the processing cycle. This includes when ballots are issued, when ballot return envelopes are received, and when ballots are scanned. There are a few important things to keep in mind as you learn from these examples. First, the details and specific processes may vary in your jurisdiction, depending on the rules of your state. Second, if you find a discrepancy during the process of reconciliation, stop and investigate the problem. To do so, it might be necessary to recount the materials or check to make sure none were misplaced or misfiled. If you cannot correct the problem, make sure to document what happened. And third, to maintain a thorough chain of custody, be sure to record the date, time, and who is performing reconciliation each time it occurs. The process for reconciling the ballots issued to voters will vary depending on the rules in your state. For example, it may be necessary for election workers to reconcile and document the total number of both applications received and ballots issued. To assist the reconciliation process, your state may provide a certain form to use, or you can create your own simple form or spreadsheet. Let's walk through an example of how reconciliation might work as ballots are issued. Imagine you are working in a state that requires voters to submit an application in order to receive a mail ballot. At the end of each day, the reconciliation steps for ballots issued might look something like this. First, log the number of applications received from each source accepted in your jurisdiction. Here we have 150 received by mail, 10 received online, and 5 received by email, for a total of 165 applications received over the course of the workday. Next, make sure that all applications received have been processed. Record the number of accepted applications, which should result in a ballot being issued to the voter. Count the number of rejected applications, for example, applications where the voter did not include their signature. When added together, 165 applications were processed in total. Finally, compare lines A and C to make sure that the numbers match. This confirms all applications received today have been processed. As ballots are issued, it's also important to check that the number of ballot packets prepared and mailed matches the number of accepted applications. Lines B and D in this example. You can reconcile these numbers as each batch of mail is prepared, or at the end of each day. Effective ballot reconciliation also involves keeping track of ballot return envelopes after they have been received from voters each day. This involves documenting the total number of ballot envelopes received, the number accepted for counting, and the number rejected. Let's walk through an example for reconciling the number of ballot envelopes received from voters. First, record the total number of ballot envelopes received through the mail, from drop boxes if applicable, and from voters who came into the election office to drop off their ballot. Add those numbers to get the total. In this case, there are 90 ballot return envelopes received. That number is entered on line A. Next, record how many ballot return envelopes were processed that day. This includes the number that are accepted, rejected, and any set aside for special processing. Adding these numbers together shows that 90 ballot return envelopes have been processed, which is entered on line B. Finally, compare lines A and B to make sure that the numbers match. This confirms all the ballot return envelopes received today have been processed. After reconciling ballot return envelopes received each day, it's a good idea to keep them carefully organized in batches before they are opened and counted. You may choose to batch receive ballots by voting precinct and date of receipt, or in another way that makes sense for your jurisdiction. All ballots should be accompanied by a chain of custody form that accounts for them at each step in the process. This form should be verified by election workers each time a batch of ballots changes hands. Finally, effective mail ballot reconciliation involves keeping track of ballots during and after counting, including when ballots are separated from return envelopes, when ballots are scanned and counted, and when counted ballots are stored. Let's walk through another scenario to illustrate the reconciliation process. Imagine you are preparing to open and scan 2 batches of accepted ballot return envelopes. For each batch of ballots, election workers start by confirming that all the envelopes that were previously accepted during processing are included. Next, Ballots are separated from their return envelopes. Any problems are documented immediately. For example, if a ballot return envelope does not actually contain a ballot inside. This helps explain why there may be more ballot return envelopes than there are ballots scanned. Now the batch of ballots is ready to be scanned. It can be helpful to scan ballots in standard quantities that can be easily tracked. For example, scanning batches of 20, 50, or 100 ballots at a time allows election workers to consistently and easily make sure that the scanner count has increased by that number. This way, any discrepancies can be found early. After scanning each batch, be sure to record the container in which the batch is eventually stored. These processes are repeated for all the other batches. Before closing for the day, the process of reconciling all the ballots scanned might look like this. First, document the number of ballot return envelopes received in each batch. The first batch included 80 envelopes, and the second included 20 envelopes for a total of 100, which is entered on line A. Next, write down the number of ballots in each batch that should have been scanned. Adding the numbers from each batch shows a total of 99 ballots should have been scanned, which is entered on line B. Lines A and B do not match because batch 1 included one return envelope that didn't actually contain a ballot. This is carefully noted. Finally, document the ballots that were actually scanned in each batch. Add them together and enter the number on line C. In this example, 99 ballots were scanned across 2 batches. Enter the number of ballots scanned according to the scanner report. Confirm that lines B, C, and D are equal, meaning that every accepted ballot was successfully scanned. At the conclusion of all processing and scanning, the final reconciliation step is to determine the cumulative number of ballots scanned across all batches and days of processing, and ensure every ballot received and accepted was included in the count. Thank you for joining this training on mail ballot reconciliation. We hope that you have learned some helpful and simple ways that you can implement reconciliation processes in your election office. Remember, effective mail ballot reconciliation is critical to ensuring the integrity and transparency of the election process. As always, thank you for your work in elections, and thank you for watching.